So just to give you some context in terms of the research I'm talking about here, actually I'm not a very normal health psychologist. I trained in cognitive neuroscience, and I'm fundamentally very behavioural in my outlook, which puts me at odds with an awful lot of health psychologists. But I switched 2011, I switched into health psychology, and very specifically the psychology of food choice behaviour, which I've been working in ever since. So a lot of what I'm going to present today comes from the work I've done when I was working with the Behaviour and Health Research Unit, which is a Department of Health funded policy research unit in the University of Cambridge. So I was in a public health context. I was surrounded by, in a department of general practice and primary care, and really surrounded by a lot of people who are not at all psychology in their outlook. So that has a certain bias to what I was doing and how it was working. I was also a postdoc underneath, I don't know if anyone knows Teresa, she's a fantastically driven woman, and it's slightly scary being a postdoc under someone like that. So there was a certain amount of tension between me and her as to how this progressed, and I learned an awful lot about handling academic relationships in the process. So the Behaviour and Health Research Unit, I've put this up here from the original aims. Essentially, in short, the unit was tasked with evaluating nudge-type interventions in the context of 4 specific behaviours that are all associated with non-communicable diseases. So diet, alcohol intake, low physical activity, and smoking. And I was given the food brief, which I was very happy with. I'm not interested in any of the other behaviours. And I was quite excited in the prospects, which was 2011, in researching nudge, because nudge was getting very exciting. David Halpern was working with David Cameron, and it was all behavioural insights, was all buzzy, and I thought, this is great, I'm going to be brilliant. It was a mixed experience. But anyway, in terms of online data collection, I'm sort of going to take you on my narrative journey to tell you where I am now. My earliest project in the brew was here's an exciting paper, can you replicate it? Which is always a good place to start when you're in a new research group. The paper came from a researcher called Alexander Chernev, who is in North America. He's very much like Brian Wansink in the kind of generating cool, very PR-friendly type findings. And this one was a neat one, which was basically saying, if you put salad next to a burger, people estimate the calorie content of the burger to be lower than if you don't have salad next to the burger. And Teresa thought this was quite exciting. But what were the implications of this? Can you replicate this effect? Fortuitously, the original paper used Mechanical Turk, so that was like, great, all right, I'm going to have to use Mechanical Turk. Whatever the negative issues are, if I'm replicating an effect using that recruitment method, it's appropriate for me to use it too. And so on all my slides, I've kind of put what I used for the study in the top right-hand corner. And they had to explore what my data collection process was. And I used SurveyMonkey because it had a free license for 6 months. Entirely pragmatic decision. What did I learn from this? The first thing I learned is that it's really easy to do a replication when you're doing online data collection. It's really quick, it's really easy. Essentially, you kind of need to get your task up and running. This was quite an easy task. Here's a picture of a burger. Here's a picture of a burger with salad. How many calories do you think it has? Bam, you're good to go. You don't, though, get the same thing the original publication got, which is no huge surprise. What we found is that the data is enormously skewed. Calorie estimates are very skewed data. Lots of people kind of have the right idea on calories, but some people are like, oh no, 10,000 calories for a burger, that's about right. Very skewed data. And the original paper had made absolutely no correction for skewed data. So we weren't quite sure what was going on there. And essentially, I played around with it and I ran a few funky alternatives, and I went, oh no, this is maybe something different to what they thought it was. It's nothing to do with, in fact, the lettuce. It's to do with how much you tell them the reference food calories are before you get going. So it's kind of neat, but nobody was very interested once I said, actually, they had analysed their data probably spuriously. What I discovered is that MTurk is a new world. It is a weird and a different place. The Turkers, the participants, are a community. There is an online platform where you, as a person posting tasks, are being evaluated, and people that do the tasks are rating you. So I could go on there and I could see what people thought of my tasks, whether they thought I was paying them fairly, whether they thought I was rejecting them fairly, whether the task was interesting. And Turkers do this. So they are not naive in every possible sense. There is an open forum where they find out from each other who you are and what you're doing. What am I doing? I don't need it. No, I don't think I need it. Thank you. What I did find out through this process was I was having to use the wrong tool for the job. So mTurk is Amazon. It's something... It's nothing to do with behavioural science, essentially. And I was using SurveyMonkey, which is designed for market research. Neither of these are tools for behavioural science, and I was desperately shoehorning them into my behavioural science experiment. And that's really tough. But you kind of have to do it, and I think a lot of the speakers we've had today have illustrated to the extent to which it's about picking the best tool for the job when the perfect tool doesn't exist. The second study I've got here was a kind of opportunistic one. We had a student go, oh, I want to do a project in your lab. And we're like, oh, OK. So again, we did an online study. It was a really simple one. And this was a really effective piece of research. Again, we used mTurk. We then used Qualtrics. And actually, this one didn't involve Inquisit. That was a different study that involved Inquisit. What I learned from here is that if you have a really stupidly simple experimental design, you can get some really nice data out of it. So here we had a task where people were picking a lunch. Here are 2 drinks, here are 2 sandwiches, and here are 2 dessert options. They were all kind of nutritionally paired and matched apart from the dessert, which was choosing an apple or a chocolate bar. And we labeled the apple in loads of different ways. So people were randomized to apple label. And we found a kind of benefit. Essentially, if you say that the apple is succulent and healthy, people are more likely to choose the apple than if you label it as either healthy or as succulent. So you kind of need to know about both taste properties and health properties. The difference is really small. It's a very tiny impact. But what was really nice about this study is I included quite a lot of additional variables because I really didn't think it would work. And I thought, well, we better give this poor student something to analyze. So we introduced a few simple measures of liking, a really nice measure of the belief that foods that are healthy can't be tasty. And what we were able to do is, even though the intervention didn't generate anything spectacular, there was some really interesting observational analysis that could be done looking at predictors of chocolate choice in this task. So, OK, the thing we wanted to get wasn't there, but we did have some nice data to report. And that was, if you like, a bit of a win in terms of data collection. After this interesting early dabble, I became the person in the lab that knew about online testing. So we then got to scaling it up. And the first thing we started doing was trying to recruit with much larger and more representative sample sizes. This paper here actually includes 2 studies. One, a smaller one, which is a more opportunistic sample, which is using the Cambridge Bioresource. The second study used a national market research agency that collected a much larger and demographically representative group of people. What can I say about this? OK, so the first thing to say, you can use, frankly, an awful lot of different possible options for recruiting participants. I used OnePoll, I've used Research Now, and I know ICM also have online panels. Essentially, the big companies that do market research, that do surveys, that do political polls, they all have online panels. And you can pay to access those panels. And pairing up their panel with any online task is really quite straightforward. And they'll help you do it. And so you write the task, they send people to your task, and once they've completed your task, you send them back, and that's how they receive payment. So it's fully anonymized in the same way that Prolific is. It's a bit more faffy than Prolific, but you can get nationally representative samples. You could also, though I never did, you could also use the same process for recruiting very specific demographics. You only want to recruit people that work in the legal profession, or you only want to recruit people with of a certain age or a certain number of children. You could go through them as well. And of course, the cost goes up with the specificity of your recruitment. But just to say, there are an awful lot of recruitment options, and if you approach these national companies, they can do your recruitment for you if you have specific needs. The other thing that was really interesting about this study is that we were looking at priming. So here we were looking at what happens is if you prime healthy food to be tasty. So we had mocked up some adverts that went, oh, bananas are really fun. What else was in there? There was some juice, I think. And then we were like, what's the impact of seeing those adverts on food choice in a hypothetical food choice scenario? So very kind of lab type. It wasn't real food choice. The initial study, which was done with Cambridge Bioresource, all of our participants were affluent, older, and mostly female. And that's a really interesting population in the context of food behaviour. They are obsessed with healthy eating. Older, educated women are there. They love you. You say you're doing a study about health and food. They want to ask you about coconut oil. They want to ask you about quinoa. They think avocados and God's gift. They're a bit boring, but they'll do your study. The interesting thing about these women is that they were delightfully responsive. I mean, they weren't all women, but this is the generalization. They were very responsive to my adverts. So when they were shown these adverts, they were more likely to choose fruits. So that buoyed us on, and we thought, oh, we've got something here, let's see. So let's scale this up. So let's go for a much larger sample of much more representative people. And so then we go for the second study with OnePoll, same task in Qualtrics. And this one we've embedded Inquisit into Qualtrics. So you can, where you have multiple platforms, you can start them on one platform, feed them through to another platform, back to the first platform, and then back to the recruiter. So if you like, I was daisy chaining participants through different software platforms. Within about a half-hour period, they go through all of that to do various components of the task. For this study, I had to do that to collect reaction time data because Qualtrics wouldn't do that for me. So I was kind of, as you can see, bending the tools to fit the need. What we then found with this larger representative sample is that the only people that responded to my adverts were those older, educated women. Nobody else in the population cares two hoots. They neither eat fruit nor do they respond to adverts about fruit. Now, this is useful, but it makes a really important point, which is when you do a study, you advertise your study, and you, by definition, will be self-selectingly getting people who are interested in your study. I recruit participants. I'm very good at recruiting women. I have a colleague in the sports sciences department who's very good at recruiting men. And I've got a plan to do a task together because he'll advertise with sports science logos. I'll advertise with psychology and health logos. And together we stand a chance of a balanced representative sample. It's not necessarily that your participants are weird. It's much more likely that they're biased in terms of being interested in what you're doing. And that will have an impact on the data you collect. So that's a really interesting finding that we found, and I think it's something that's worth considering. Platforms like Prolific, they are not recruiting people to take part in the platform because it offers anything to do with food or health specifically. So they're much less likely driven by that kind of the brand label, the area in which your study is situated. And I think that's a really important reason for keeping recruitment at an arm's length from study design and labs. But you can get very unexpected results, is my finding there. The next thing we did is we engaged with something that was much more realistic. Now, this is where I'm going to switch to, look, I got it working, it's up online. We had made for us supermarkets because we were interested in food and food choice. And in fact, this is one of the earliest projects I think that Cauldron were involved with, which is to make us a research supermarket where we could get participants online. We as the experimenters could play around with the supermarket, what are the prices of the products, how are they labelled, were there adverts in there. We can monitor what everyone does, we can see what they buy, and we can ask some other questions before and after. So just to give you a sense, this was a fascinating exercise because, I haven't logged in. Let me log in again. The thing that was most fascinating about this is that when we spoke with the programmers, we had an open bidding process to do this, and so we spoke to multiple programmers. They were all up for creating something slick and beautiful and elegant and modern, and we said, no, it's got to look like Tesco's online. So it's got to kind of look clunky and crap. And they went, oh, oh, that's really sad. So it looks clunky and crap on purpose. So you've got all these products in here. What we were able to do is download the full product inventory of Tesco's, which is kind of exciting. We have 11,000 products in there, and we were able to partner that with macronutrient data on every single product. So the calorie count, the fat content, the sugar content, etc. No real shopping takes place on this platform. It's entirely kind of hypothetical shopping, which is one of the criticisms of it. So here are some screenshots. There are foods. You can see the products, and you can add them to your trolley, and then you can check out. So the aim of this was to look at more realistic experiments, more realistic behaviour. What do people do when you, instead of giving them, here's an apple chocolate bar, which do you want? Very hypothetical. What happens when you send them into a platform and say, buy lunch for 4? What do they buy? And does the presence of adverts in that space promoting how much bananas make you smile, does that make a difference? And of course, the answer is, it turns out, no, it doesn't make a huge difference. We managed to run 3 or 4 studies on this platform, but it flagged up some really big issues with how to use realistic behavior in online tasks. So we've got 2 studies here. The one on the left was about offering swaps, and the one on the right is about taxation and subsidizing products, healthier or less healthy products within a supermarket. The taxation and subsidy one did involve participants purchasing them, and so they did then receive a delivery, but it was only in the context of drinks and cereals, so it was a very narrow subset of categories. And that was done in collaboration with a team of economists, which is a very interesting voyage of academic discovery, if ever there was one. So what I learnt from this, when you are dealing with realistic behaviour, there are really huge numbers of dimensions to explore. And what I came away from this was realising was that as a research team, we really struggled to focus. I could see what I wanted to focus on, but I was not able to communicate that to my team members. There are a lot of different behaviours, there are a lot of different intervention options, there are a lot of different outcomes, there are a lot of different tasks, there are a lot of different stimuli. And in this kind of setting, which I think may be different from Hugo's task, the participants can navigate themselves any which way they want through this platform. They can search for products, they can buy the meal before the dessert, they can do it any which way they like. And we wanted that for ecological validity, because that's what we do when we go shopping. But it meant that as an experience in terms of psychology and behaviour, we had the most enormous numbers of degrees of freedom possible. And let alone analysing the data, us as researchers didn't really know what we were trying to get out of the platform. So we only got 2 published papers out of it, probably because we as academics writing up what we were trying to do couldn't really get our head around what it was we were doing. It was way too multi-armed and multi-legged. What we also found, and I think this speaks a bit to what Vaughan experienced, is that when we published it, the peer reviewers were also very confused. So when we sent a paper that hasn't ever been published, actually, which was about priming and adverts, for peer review, we got 2 reviews. One evaluating it as if it was a lab study, saying, you haven't controlled exposure, you haven't controlled this, you haven't controlled that. And we're like, no, they're in an online supermarket. Of course we haven't. Second review going, but there's no validity here. They're not spending their own money. You've given them a shopping list. This is not a real field experiment. No, we never said it was. But in the public health and health psychology literature, there is very much a dichotomous view. A study is either lab or it's field. And what we were doing was something in between that they couldn't categorise and they couldn't evaluate it on its own merits. You can't run these kinds of studies in real supermarkets, and you can't really do them as lab experiments. So really this was a good way to go, but our peer reviewers couldn't kind of get themselves out of their silos. So where next? I've got a few slides here. What I wished I knew before I started. These are my nuggets of wise wisdom. Not all that glitters is gold. I spent disproportionate amounts of time believing published papers with small sample sizes done in labs. and it's broken my heart. But don't please do that. If you do have something that's fundamental to your question, your area, your discipline, maybe try and replicate it, but be careful in terms of how you design your study. Be sure to try and keep in touch with the applied value of the research. What is the context within which you're doing this? If you can keep in touch with that, you may have something that you can salvage when that phenomenon that was so exciting in the original paper doesn't replicate. Be powered for subgroup analysis. Be ready to have a finding that is only true of the narrow group of people that were in that original paper. And be ready, and that's actually quite difficult. You need to be ready. You need to understand how powering for a main effect is different to be powered for an interaction. And you need a very different sample size to be able to do that. Include observational as well as experimental components. This, if you like, is a great backup. No one's going to be confused by an observational statistical observation. You can report your experimental, your randomized condition, and it doesn't generate any findings. But if you've got something observational, that's a useful backup. What else? My second one, get your head around statistics. Large and representative samples are not a panacea. They can promise really useful data and really interesting answers, but you will still have to work to understand some things that we're not all very comfortable with, and that's basically stats. You need to know, and you need to have as a team of researchers pinned to your retina your primary research question and outcome. You need to know what would be considered a useful effect size. One of the papers from the supermarket, we powered for a particular effect size. We had 1,000 people doing the study. We found things that were significant, but they were much smaller than the effect size that we were powered to find. So even though we have a large sample size and we're really well powered for the effect size that we're looking for, we're not so well powered for a much smaller effect size. And therefore, it may well have been a false positive. That's taken me quite a lot of conversations with people more statistically literate than me to get my head around all of that. And then what I had to do, so make sure you do your sample size calculations, understand the difference between planned and exploratory analyses, and here where pre-registration is really important. I haven't done it yet. I haven't done the open science thing, but God, I know it's useful. Make sure you understand your statistical method, and this is the clincher. Be ready to explain it to all of your colleagues who don't understand it, and stand your ground. I've been in some really difficult conversations with people who, with hindsight, I absolutely know they had no idea what I was talking about. They had not spent the time I had talking with statisticians, trying to understand power, sample size calculations, trying to understand moderation of effects. They just hadn't got their head around all these things. I should have stuck to my guns, and I didn't. And in hindsight, I regret that. Get yourself to be statistically literate. Am I running over? Sorry. And the final thing, which I think has been iterated already by others, be kind to your participants. They will give you better data if you do. There's a few things there which actually other people have all mentioned. So essentially, what am I doing now? I'm using fit-for-purpose platforms. I'm recruiting large samples. I am taking inspiration from interesting lab studies, but I'm keeping in mind the applied dimension, and I'm keeping all my tasks as short as I possibly can, because you get more and better data that way. Thank you.